But no, I feel like I have a word here today that I've been studying and looking into, and I'd like to share it with you. I've been reading the Bread program, you know, the last sermon I started. Thank you. Rookie move. I've been reading the Bread program, as many of you have, and if you're on the same part that I am, you just finished Esther not too long ago. And I love reading Esther. It's a great story. It's almost like a novel when you're reading it. And so this was really on my mind when I was coming and preparing to speak for you today. And so I thought I might as well just talk about what's been on my mind. I found that's often the best way to have a word, is that whatever's been egging at you or just taking up all of your thoughts is usually something that other people need to hear. And I want to talk about the story because it's a great story. It's got drama, suspense, intrigue, and I think it's rich also, not only with those themes, but it's rich with spiritual guidance and instruction. So I want to tell you the story of Esther today. It's a story many of us have heard before, maybe even many times before if you've been in Sunday school. I know my youth have heard this story. I taught it to you myself. So be prepared for various quizzes throughout this lesson. I'll be calling on you to tell me what happened. And maybe we've heard it a lot of times before, but I kind of want to tell it a little bit differently today. Rather than a love story or a story of political intrigue, betrayal, success, I want to tell you a ghost story today. I want to tell you the story of the haunting of Esther. You might see it on my title slide. Stay with me, okay? I'm telling you a ghost story today because my dad's not here. We can get away with stuff like that. But really, stay with me. I have some stuff to say about this. But I am a teacher. You know, those of you who know what I do, I teach professionally. And you know, as a teacher, I've got to give you some historical context. I love historical context. So we're going to talk a little bit about the historical context of Esther before we really get into the message. So this book was written during and about the Jewish exile. So you guys have heard of the Jews, right? Let my people go, those Moses people, the Israelites, right? We've heard the stories of the Hebrew people leaving Egypt during the time of Moses to find the promised land. Yeah, we remember this? Yes. The Israelites go in search of their promised land, and they eventually make it there. And it's a really good story, and it's very victorious. They eventually come into their promised land, and they claim their inheritance, but that's not where their story ends. They do find the promised land. They do get there. They do inherit it. But eventually, after so many hundred years, they become exiled from the promised land. They eventually turn away from God as a nation. They turn their backs to him, and they eventually fall into the hands of Babylonian power. And the Babylonians say, in order to make you a weaker people and more easy to control, we're going to take you away from your homeland, and we're going to put you in exile in Babylon. So they carried these people away, all the Israelites, they carried them away, and they said, you're going to live here in exile. And so the Israelites eventually lost the promised land. And that's where this story takes place. Esther takes place in that exile, right? Then where we have this story is that they've been taken away and they're living in exile, and they're actually now, instead of under Babylonian reign, they're now under Persian reign, right? The Persian Empire has taken over, so they have new rulers, but they're still living in exile. And it's this historical background that gives us the story of Esther. Not only is it a story about a marginalized group of people living in exile, it also was written for a marginalized group of people living in exile. So we don't really know exactly when Esther was written, but we know at least that it was written either while they were in exile, while the Jewish people were still in exile, saying this is a story that happened, a recent history, or it was written just as they were returning from exile. So eventually the Jews were allowed to return to their promised land, and this story was either written there when they were returning, or it was written while they were still in exile, right? So we have a group of people who are seeking stories that will enlift them, right? We have people, they haven't had, the last couple hundred years have not been great for the Jews. They're pretty downtrodden people. They're not victorious like they were when they were exiting the promised land, or when they were exiting the Egypt and finding the promised land. They're pretty beaten down right now. It's not a good time for them. And yes, they're allowed to return to the promised land, but it's not a victorious return, really. They are basically said, okay, go ahead, go back and build your temple. And they're basically saying, like, our kingdom is nothing to what it was before. I remember reading this, and they said, we just want a nail in the kingdom of God. We can't even hope to return the kingdom to what it used to be. We are a downtrodden people. But spoiler alert, this story does have a happy ending. It has a very victorious ending. As you probably know, most of us have heard the story of Esther. And it has a victorious ending, so no wonder the Jewish people still today celebrate the story of Esther with the festival and feast of Purim. And it's one of their most celebratory holidays. It's one of their most joyous holidays. It's not like the Passover where everyone is sad and remembering like how we almost died, right? It is a very celebratory holiday, right? Everyone feasts, right? The Feast of Purim, it makes sense. They're all eating. They dress up like in costumes. It's almost like Halloween. They're dressed up, right? They give gifts and they bake little pastries that are like triangle pastries, and they're actually meant to symbolize Haman's ear, which is kind of gross, but you know, whatever. They're trying to symbolically destroy his memory. So it's a very fun and exciting holiday. And they actually, whenever they are celebrating the Feast of Purim, they read the story of Esther aloud. Makes sense, kind of like I'm not going to read the whole story today. I'll give you an abbreviated version as usual. But when they read it aloud and they all love the reading, and it's a very interactive reading of the story of Esther. Do you know what they do? When they're reading the story of Esther, anytime they mention the name Haman, the villain of the story, if you don't know, Haman is the villain of the story. Anytime that name is mentioned, they all boo. You guys want to do that today? Right, Miley? That sounds fun. When I say Haman, you boo! Boo! The villain of this story. It's very interactive. So let's practice. If I say, oh, the story of Esther is the story of a woman who had to defeat a man by the name of Haman. All right, you're good at this, we'll keep going. Okay, so he's probably not going to come back for a little bit, so you have to be ready when you boo. Like, I'm going to talk for a little bit, and he won't come up, but you have to be ready, all right? So let's get into the story, right? We have a very victorious story that the Jews are telling and reciting because they want to remember at least some victory that they have. They're looking for inspiring stories to uplift them as they are either living in exile or returning from their exile. They're looking for uplifting stories. So let's talk about that story. Right, remember, they're living in Persia with a Persian king, and that guy's name is King Xerxes. Right, at least that's the Greek version of his name. So you might hear me read another name, but remember, it's King Xerxes. King Xerxes is throwing a party. Does this sound familiar, youth? King Xerxes is throwing a party, and he's trying to hype up his nobles and officials because he wants to do a war. He wants to go into war, and in order to convince everyone that this war is a good idea, he throws a party, and he's like, we're going to get all excited. We're going to get everyone excited for this war I want to do. He wants to wage war against Greece, and so he gets everyone together, and we're going to get hype. It's a war party, right? So it's party, they're partying, and the party goes as parties go, and King Xerxes gets what? You guys remember? What happens to King Xerxes? He's excited, he's partying. What happens? You guys remember? Yes, that's good. So he gets really, really drunk, and he says, he's with all his friends, they're being obnoxious, they're being drunk men, and they said, guys, guess what? My wife is super beautiful. My wife, Vashti, she's like the most beautiful woman you've ever seen. And so he calls his wife, and he says, go tell Vashti to come, and I want to show her to all my friends. We're talking about this a little goofily, right? Because when I tell it to the youth, I tell it like a goofy story. But really, this is not a respectful request. He's asking the queen of Persia, a woman who is supposedly the highest position in the land. No woman is higher than Queen Vashti. And he's saying, you come, and I'm going to have all my friends ogle you and gawk at you and just and make you into an object, right? So he asked the queen to come and be ogled by all of his friends and gawked at. And Vashti refused this frivolous request. So that's really frivolous. And I'm not going to do that. I have more self-respect than that, right? Enter the advisors. King Xerxes is surrounded by all of these advisors and officials. He's surrounded by many voices. And the way that Xerxes is characterized in the Bible is that he's very swayed easily by voices. He's surrounded by people telling him what to do, and he listens to those people telling him what to do. And so the king is surrounded by these voices, and many of them are fighting for their own power, such as Haman. There you go. I thought you weren't going to get it. All right. He's surrounded by men such as Haman, who want their own power. And they tell the king, can you pull up Esther 1:17 for me, please? They tell the king that this deed of the queen, her deciding not to come, will become known to all women, causing them to show contempt for their husbands when it is reported. King Ahasuerus, I don't even know how to pronounce that, but it's King Xerxes, that's that guy. King Xerxes commanded Vashti, the queen, to be brought in before him, but she didn't come. So his advisors are saying, if it gets out that your wife refused you, all of the wives are going to rebel. And we can't have the women getting mad and rebelling. That would be horrible. So what does King Xerxes do? Basically, thank you, Colton. Exactly. King Xerxes removes Vashti as queen. Traditionally, though the Bible doesn't really mention that, it's traditionally held that she was executed. Oof. It's a fun story to tell, but when we tell the story, it's actually quite serious, right? As interesting and engaging as the story of Esther is, it is not a fairy tale. I think sometimes when we tell Bible stories, because we all remember Sunday school, whenever Matthew is there telling stories and he's all silly and goofy, that sometimes we mix up Bible stories and we think of them as fairy tales, right? The story of Esther is not a fairy tale. It's a true story of many, many helpless people under the power of people with too much power, right? Not only is Queen Vashti under the hand of this king, the Jews are under the hand of this king, and King Xerxes shows himself to be pretty frivolous. He gets drunk, he demands his wife to come before him, and then kills her when she doesn't. So he proves himself to be frivolous with this request, and worse, he proves himself to be vengeful with his response. Not only that, but remember that war I was talking about that this banquet was all about? That war turned out to be an enormous flop. This king is he follows the wind. He's very easily swayed. This war he was wanting to wage, they was embarrassing. They got crushed by the Greeks, right? Is this giving you a good picture of King Xerxes? I think it's it's not a great picture. I'm saying, like, do you have an accurate understanding? I see what you did there, right? He's not a great guy. He's pretty frivolous. He's pretty scary. He's pretty vengeful. So whenever I was reading the story of Esther recently in the Bread program, I got a really big itch to watch One Night with the King. Have you guys ever seen that movie? It's a movie about the story of Esther, and I was watching it because I'm like, I'm reading this, I kind of want to watch this again. I remember from when I was a kid. And when I remember the story as a kid, I remember really liking it. But now I watch it, and they frame the story of Esther as a love story. The whole movie is essentially a love story. And this king, King Xerxes, is like pictured as a heartthrob, rather than the frivolous, sort of unexpectable and fickle man that he is. He's literally shirtless for most of the movie. He's extraordinarily hot, and this story is framed as a love story where Esther falls in love with this gorgeous king. It's a frivolous romance. But remember, the Bible is not a fairy tale. This story is not a romantic story. It's not a love story. Esther was called in to replace an unfairly murdered queen whose name then followed her for her entire reign. She was haunted by the story of Vashti. Remember the title there? It's coming back there. Okay, so maybe she was not literally haunted by Vashti, right? There's not a ghost following her around the castle. But literally in the Bible, Vashti's name follows Esther where she goes. It's haunting her. It's following after her. It's nipping on her heels. Multiple times the story of Esther continues to bring up Vashti after she's long gone from the story. In Esther 2:1, don't worry, I didn't have this one for you, you don't have to pull it up. Xerxes remembered Vashti. So after he already sent her away, she remembered her and what she had done. In 2:4, it said they were looking for a woman to become queen instead of Vashti. Every time they're talking about this, they bring up Vashti's name again. And finally, in 2:17, if you could pull up that scripture, Esther 2:17, it said, the king loved Esther more than all of the women, and she obtained favor and kindness in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. When I was reading this story in the Bible as part of sitting in my living room, quietly reading the story, I was like drawn up in the story of Esther. And at this point, it's becoming a climax, right? Like Esther's doing really great. She's brought into the castle. She's being elevated. She's finding really good favor. Everyone's kind of helping her along the way. And then I get to this climactic point of the story. If you could leave it up. If you get to this climactic point of the story and you're like, the king loved Esther more than all. Could you put the scripture back up, please? The king loved Esther more than all, and she obtained favor and kindness in his sight more than all the virgins. So he put the crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. I was like, ooh, it hit me in the heart there. Like it's like supposed to be this really successful time for Esther. She's supposedly falling in love with this gorgeous king. And then at the very end, boom, Vashti's name comes back to haunt her. Made queen instead of Vashti. A scripture that's supposedly talking about love is haunted by his previously murdered wife. Right? Let's leave murder out of it, ladies. Let's pretend that he didn't murder her. Ladies, let's say you're getting married and your husband is giving his vows to you. It's supposed to be very magnificent time. And at the end, he says, I love you instead of insert your ex's name. Romantic, right? Jokes aside, Esther was thrust into a very dangerous situation. She was surrounded by scheming politicians. She was married to a very fickle king who murdered his last wife. And she is haunted by the history of queens who are easily disposed. She was followed by the story of her predecessor, and she would have to step lightly in the rest of her story. Not only was Esther haunted by this previous wife, this murdered queen, she was also haunted by her people's history. The crux of Esther's story surrounds the plotting of a man named Haman. Right? Haman. Yeah, excellent. Haman is slighted by a Jewish man, Mordecai, Esther's uncle. He is slighted when Mordecai refuses to bow to him as he's walking past. And so Haman totally rationally decides to kill all the Jews because of this slight. Remember that, youth. If one of you ever makes you mad, it's all of you. You make me mad, I kill all of you, right? So this is the plot that Esther was up against. Because a very small man is slighted by a Jewish man, he decides to convince the King Xerxes to kill all of the Jews. He convinces King Xerxes that the Jewish are a very rebellious people and that they threaten the crown. And because, again, King Xerxes is very easily swayed by the voices around him, he says, you're right. I sign off. I give you the death warrant of this entire group of people. I sign off on a genocide. That's what a genocide is, killing an entire group of people just for their ethnicity or race. This is the plot that Esther was up against. A law approved by the king sentencing an entire race of people to death, and therefore also unknowingly signing the death warrant of his own wife, because remember, Esther is also a Jew. And so because he signs off on this death warrant, he unknowingly also signs the death warrant of his wife. But we'll get back to that. What's important right now is who Haman, there we go. What's important is who he was. He was an Agagite. And an Agagite basically means a descendant of King Agag. King Agag was the king of a group of people called the Amalekites. And the Amalekites and the Jewish people, their history goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. They have a long-standing history of conflict, right? It's not a happy history. The Amalekites were the first enemy that the Israelites ever encountered in the Promised Land. They were literally entering the Promised Land, and the Jewish people were just like, hey, we're going this way, we're gonna leave you be. They were gonna just walk by and leave them because God said, just leave them alone. And they're walking by to claim their Promised Land, and the Amalekites follow after their caravan of people and start murdering the women and children. Because when a caravan walks by, you have all of like the men going first, carrying things, leading the way, and then you have the smaller, slower, elderly women Elderly people, not just women and children, elderly people, women and children would follow at the end of a caravan. They were the slower ones, right? Elderly people can't walk fast. Children can't walk fast. Remember, have you ever held Mia's hand? Come on, let's go, come on, let's go, come on. They're slow. Children, toddlers are slow. So we have all of these vulnerable people at the end of the caravan, and the Amalekites come, and instead of starting at the front, which is traditional, to fight the men, they started at the back, and they just started picking off the women and children. Not a fun history with the Amalekites, am I right? So here Esther was facing a descendant of her historical enemy. The Jews and Amalekites are historical heritage enemies, right? And she's dealing with this problem because the Israelites left the Amalekite problem unsolved. So they were affected in this battle. They were attacked, and the Israelites fought back, and they did defeat the Amalekites. They did, but they allowed them to linger in the Promised Land. They did not get rid of the people who attacked them and threatened them. They allowed them to linger. They took part of their plunder, and they started to dabble in their gods. And we all know how that story ends, right? The exile, right? They turn away from God, and after many hundred years, they lose access to the promised land. But what is important here is that Esther was dealing with the consequences of her ancestors who never resolved this issue. They left it to fester. They left it to continue to be a problem. And now Esther has to deal with this problem of Haman, the descendant of her Yes, thank you. I forgot about that one. The descendant of her longtime enemy is now coming back to haunt her. She is haunted by her history. She is haunted by the mistakes of her ancestors. In fact, her whole people, languishing in exile, grasping at and trying to reclaim the kingdom that was once theirs, were being haunted by the decisions of their ancestors. Now, today, we don't call it long historical heritage enemies, right? You might be familiar. This might sound familiar to someone here, right? I know a lot of people in our church are dealing with struggling to get past the decisions made by those who come before them, or maybe even your own decisions. The Bible actually says that some of the people who were living in exile it wasn't a very long exile. There were people living there who remembered the original temple before it was destroyed. There were people old enough who remembered it was their decisions. So maybe this history that you're struggling with is your own history, or maybe it's one that you didn't choose. Today, we don't call it the historical enemy of the Amalekites. Today, we call it a family history of addiction. We call it cycles of abuse. We call it intergenerational violence. That's what we deal with today. Our historical enemy of the Amalekites is not a band of plunderers who are going to attack our children at the end of the line. What we deal with today are cycles of abuse, cycles of poverty, cycles of issues that we still deal with that are not our fault. We are struggling and haunted by the decisions of those who have come before us. Many of you today are haunted by a past that you may or may not have chosen. Like Esther, that history lingers around your present. The history is nipping at your heels. Like Esther, that history affects the decisions that you're making today. Like Israel, you might be exiled from your promised land right now. You might be separated from where you want to be. It is this history that haunted Esther when she became queen. When she was burdened with the task of saving her entire people from exile, she had this history of the mistakes of her ancestors who allowed sin and the enemy to fester and linger and even participated in. Now, she's dealing with this history as she is tasked with this burden of saving her people. So why Esther? Why was Esther chosen? The movie that I was talking about, referring to, One Night with the King, made it out that she was like this perfect, wonderful person. That she came off as extremely charismatic. Children followed in her wake like she was a Disney princess surrounded by woodland creatures. She was eloquent, an excellent speaker, and storyteller. She was somehow literate, which doesn't make sense for women of this time. Usually only priests at this time were literate, but they made her out to be this literate person who could read and analyze complex texts. They made it seem like she was worthy of the position because she earned it through popular vote. Like, oh yeah, everyone would vote for Esther. That's the person that we would choose. But, voting is kind of a touchy subject right now. Did anyone see the debate this weekend? My social media has been blowing up, right? And I've got friends on both sides of the political spectrum. And let me tell you, no one is happy. Is anyone here happy? I don't think anyone's happy, right? So no one is happy. There's always something wrong with the opposite opponent. There is always something wrong with the person who is running for president or for any office, right? When you're a human elected to a human office, you will always be criticized for all of your human errors. There is never a perfect person for a human-made appointed position. I can promise you that no one here, no candidate, no one, will ever achieve perfection. No matter how popular of a candidate you are, you will always in some way be unsuited to the position. But it's a completely different story when you are called to a God-appointed position. When you are not elected by a man, but by God. And that's what happened with Esther. So why was Esther chosen? Can we pull up Esther 2:7? And he, 2:7, thank you. And he, this is Mordecai, brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, so Hadassah is Esther's Jewish name, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, saying like, okay, we're getting some backstory on Esther, right? The maid was fair and beautiful, who Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So this is the only description we get of Esther before she became queen, about why she was chosen to be queen. And it is because she was fair and beautiful. She was beautiful. And you might want to say like, oh, fair might mean that she was like, no, it's a synonym for beautiful. She was beautiful, right? Esther was chosen because she was beautiful. That's really the only description we get of her before she became queen. We learn that she's so beautiful, in fact, that she didn't even need jewelry to outshine the other contestants who were being brought before the king. She was so beautiful, she didn't need any adornment. That was how beautiful she was. Now, it's very easy to take this fact and say, well, that's just the culture of the day. She had to be beautiful in order to become king. I mean, King Xerxes, come on, this guy, he's not going to be convinced by a brain. He wants beauty. He had Vashti come before his friends simply because she was beautiful. And so it's very easy to say that the only reason we get this description is because we need to know that she was beautiful in order to capture the attention of a king. And that's partially true. That is right. She needed to be beautiful in order to become queen. But I think the more important reason is to show that Esther did not get there on her own talents. Esther was made queen for the arbitrary reason of her beauty. She was not made queen because she had a skill in speech or diplomacy or that she was particularly good at the arts, right? There is no description of her being in any way eloquent. There is only her beauty. And there is no question that she was made queen because God put her there. It was nothing that she cultivated, nothing she could do to have earned the position of being queen. God put her there. I am telling everyone in this church today that it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're good at a million things or you're good at nothing. It doesn't matter where you come from, what your history is, what's haunting you and following you from your past. You have been put in this life for a purpose. You have been divinely appointed for a reason. Even if it seems like your past is sticking around, like it's nipping at your heels, even if it seems like you have been exiled to a place that is far from your promised land, you have been divinely appointed for a reason. Esther was appointed to that position to save her people. You might be appointed to your job because someone needs to hear and know about Jesus. You might be in the hospital because someone needs to hear your testimony. You might be in exile because God is building your testimony. There was one time that I was at church camp, and I was talking to a friend of mine who I hadn't seen in a year or so, and I asked her how she was doing, and she said, it's been really bad lately. And she started telling me about this issue that she was having with her church, and it was really weighing her down, and it was really it was affecting her ministry. She said it was affecting her heart. It was affecting her ability to come to this camp and celebrate, because she knew she would have to go back to this situation. And ironically, coincidentally enough, the situation she described was something that I had experienced myself. And when I had experienced, I was also very pouty and very upset that I wasn't being supported, or I wasn't having the community that I needed at that time. Don't worry, no one here is at fault. It was a very long time ago. And I was so cranky about it. But a couple of years later, when I was talking to this friend, I realized that I had knowledge for her. I had a testimony to give her. I had something to share. And so I told her about what happened to me, how I got through it, what we had to do, and it ended up speaking to her in that moment. And she took that home, and she texted me a couple of months later and said that it had revolutionized her church. And it wasn't anything I did, because I didn't tell her like anything particularly insightful. I just said, this happened to me, this is what we did. And she said that that is exactly what her church needed. And it was, I went through that hard time so that I could share with her how to get through her hard time. Brother Russell, is there something you wanted to add? I'm going to stop you right there, because I'm getting there. So I'm getting there. Okay. That's exactly where we're headed, Brother Russell. So we'll get there in a second. Yep. Okay, so. Exactly. So Esther 5:14 says, for if thou altogether, is this Esther 5:14? Oh, no, that's not the right one. Okay, so I'm reading, it must be something else, but so just take that down. So it's the most famous scripture from Esther. It might be 7:14. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? It's the most famous passage from Esther. To give you some context, and if we could have the piano player come. This is the most famous passage from Esther, and it's Mordecai reaching out to Esther as she is tasked with the burden of saving her people. Esther was being asked to go and plead for the Jews' sake in front of a king who, remember, this king, fickle, easily swayed, violent, and vengeful. She's being asked to go speak before this man and on the Jews' behalf. She has the death of Vashti, the queen, before her, lurking in that decision, affecting her present. And in this scripture, Mordecai reaches out to strengthen her will. And he says, you might want someone else to come up and take this burden from your plate. You might want someone else to come and say, you're better than this. You can do this. If I can't do this, you've got to send Zach to go do it. I can't preach today. You've got to make Matthew preach. I'm not good at it. I can't witness. You have to send someone else to save that friend. Mordecai reaches out to her and says, you might want someone else to do that. Someone braver, someone better, someone more well-spoken, someone better for the job. And here's the thing. God can. He can find someone better for the job. There is someone better for the job. And Mordecai says, you might want that to happen, and if you do, help will arise for the Jews from some other place. You can shirk this burden. You can, and he will find someone else. But he first chose you. He chose you because he knows you can, that you're capable. We live in a really scary time right now, a really unstable time. Sometimes I'm watching the news and I get really afraid. And I say, I wish I was born some other time. Time more peaceful, sometime more economically secure, less dangerous, less natural disasters happening all the time, sometime less scary. I think that I'm not suited to live in these last days. I'm not strong enough. I might crumble under the weight of what I'm being asked to do. But we are born for such a time as this. We are born for this time. We were called for this time. We were divinely appointed for this time. And yeah, we can say no. We can say, I'm not going to shoulder this burden. It's not going to be me. And God can and will find someone else. God doesn't need us. We need God. Accepting the will of God doesn't save God. Doesn't do anything for him. It saves us. Accepting the will of God saves us from destruction. Walking in the will of God in whatever path he has laid out for you, whether it's difficult, whether you feel like you can do it or not, walking in the ways of God is the surest way to salvation. It is the safest passage. I invite all of you to this altar today to accept that appointment. Accept the position. Even when you don't feel good enough, even when you don't feel capable, when you have a history that's lurking in your past and calling you to stop, saying that you can't do it, when you have that lingering in your past, I want you to say, yes, God, I will do it. I accept, I agree. And whenever you feel the decisions of people who have come before you, and you say, like, I can't get over that. I'm too weak. I'm not capable. I can't escape this generational curse, this generational cycle. I want you to know that it's not about you and what you can do. It's about the God who has chosen the position.